Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session of the doctoral seminar. My name is Dominique Somda. I'm a researcher at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. The seminar is streaming on Facebook, and you will find a recording later on the HUMA YouTube channel. Today, we are welcoming, and I'm sorry, I have a little glitch, but today we are welcoming Khwezi Mkhize in this seminar. Khwezi is a senior researcher at the University of Wits, is in the Department of African Literature, is an editor at African Studies. He's preparing his book at the moment, and I want to say, I'm sorry, I mixed my presentation paper for you. That's why I'm trying to do that from memory, from what I know of you. And something that I know of you is that we first met at the University of Pennsylvania, where you completed your PhD in the Center for African Studies. So welcome, welcome, Khwezi. Sorry for the little mix-up, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dominic, and hello to everyone. I think people are all over the country, as well as outside of South Africa. So thank you for joining us, especially for those who are not in the same time zone as us. You might intermittently hear a young person's voice. That's my daughter, who's somewhere in the background, who might want to join us. But she's done at school, so yeah. I decided for a number of reasons. The title of the talk is it new? Genealogy, Self, and the Quest for Novelty. In part because my experience as a graduate student and as someone who's sort of transitioning from having finished a PhD and the dissertation to working on their first book, which directly comes out of the dissertation, is having had to confront the question oftentimes in relation to one's work, right? Is it new? Is it interesting? What is it doing for the field or the fields that you're in? And I would like to assume that in some way or another, it's something of a shared kind of problem, sometimes even angst. So I'd like to simply, using my own sort of work and trajectory, try to maybe generate a number of responses to that question: what might be at stake, how it might be reconfigured, as a way of trying to sort of address one of the things that I think, particularly at the kind of later stages of the PhD, into sort of the early sort of phases of one's job market and trying to get a book out, which, I'm sort of trying to get to that point myself, sort of becomes, a kind of substantial issue. So I'll offer these remarks hopefully as a provocation, and we could all have a collective discussion of these issues. Okay. There we go. And let me just try to hide the slides. Okay, so I'll just talk to the slides as they come, and the minor sort of keywords for me, question of genealogy that I think is important, the question of the self, one's relationship to the topic and the research, as well as some of the larger kind of issues that might pull us in different directions, such as the idea of whether our work is new, what is it that is unique, that it's contributing. But the first thing before sort of moving in that direction is to share a bit of wisdom that I had to confront myself, which is that the only good dissertation is a done dissertation, that oftentimes we get so caught up in producing what's going to be, the brilliant and magnificent work, that sometimes we might risk causing ourselves many anxieties about finishing. And indeed, sometimes people do not finish their degree precisely because, you get caught up in trying to produce the ultimate work in a process of what is really the first step in what's going to be a much sort of larger, much larger career. So how does one calibrate a sense of the distribution of one's sort of intellectual energies in completing a certain kind of process that also creates conditions for other moments in one's intellectual and research career and teaching career. So this idea of the only good dissertation is a done dissertation is one that I find it can be a bit blunt, but I think it's a useful thing to keep in mind. My cursor is not working. So, but then there's also the question of then what is a dissertation? I'm aware that I'm sort of coming at a particular moment and angle, and we've had many different discussions. But for me, what's intimately linked to this notion is really an intimate understanding of what a dissertation is. And as I'll come back to this point much later on, a dissertation is not a book. And sometimes we sort of get caught up in sort of trying to produce something that looks like a book, because a lot of the scholarship that we're reading is either in article form or book form, right? But a dissertation is decidedly a different kind of intellectual exercise to either one of those, right? Sorry. And of course, a major thing about a dissertation, which is an examinable, substantial piece of research, is that it establishes and demonstrates one's expertise in relation to a field of scholarly research or fields of scholarly research, which I think is important because in some senses, it's also part of one's calling card, right? The material that's in your dissertation, the expertise that you have, is most likely part of what it is that you're going to be teaching on in some way, shape, or form, right? So beyond the MA and sort of the mastery of those fields, being able to have the kind of comprehensive sense of the field through your own personal research is still a part of demonstrating your ability to take these topics to the classroom, to make different kinds of connections between fields and scholarly fields, as well as different kinds of genealogies, an ability to reconfigure things in ways that allow certain kinds of possibilities to also become legible, right? But ultimately, I mean, this is something that's going to be sort of assessed and sort of examined by a very sort of small group of people that are experts in that field or those fields as well, right? Okay. So in that sense, the question of a dissertation is a scholarly question, but it's also a question about visibility, right? What is it that allows your identity to sort of have that kind of public presence, right? But one of the things that one often confronts is the idea of what is new, right? Outside of the maybe more intimate circles that we have with friends who are also scholars or people that might be reading our work more intimately, a lot of the time, part of presenting your work requires the skill of being able to sort of synthesize your ideas and your arguments in a fairly pithy way that perhaps might even border on feeling like something of a semi-mischaracterization of one's work. And yet at the same time, it's a part of the exercise of, again, calibrating one's visibility in relation to broader sort of audiences and then intellectual communities, right? But the idea, is it new, which I wanted to sort of say a little bit more about, can also create a whole lot of anxiety, which it also did in my case. One, how do you know if your work is actually new, if it's path-breaking, or as some people might say, changing the field, right? Is it necessary for your work to be doing all of the above in order for it to be valuable and to be a worthwhile intellectual exercise? And what does it mean for your dissertation and everything else that follows that your dissertation is supposed to make possible, right? So for me, my own response to the question of is it new is to also throw into mix a series of other ideas, right? About one's sort of relationship to that, to one's field or fields, right? Some people might talk about the idea of pushing the field forward. Some of these assessments or judgments you cannot make about your own work, I would assume, right? So in the context of my experience, and my work is in what you might call sort of Black global literatures and cultures that involve sort of reading sort of literature as in novels and poetry, etc., but also reading other forms of print culture such as pamphlets, newspapers, periodicals, etc., right? And for me as a postgraduate student, PhD student, and it's somewhat changed given that more work sort of comes up. The two major texts that really galvanize my own relationship to my work are the following. One is The Practice of Diaspora, Literature Translation and the Rise of Black Internationalism by Brent Hayes Edwards, which came out in 2003. So that's about 19 years now. And in 2005, Michelle Ann Stevens published Black Empire, the Masculine Global Imaginary of Caribbean Intellectuals in the United States, right? And there are a number of ways in which these works were, substantial in their various fields, but within the larger discipline that I see myself as belonging to, right? One, Brent Hayes Edwards' book made a very important argument about the process or the act of translation in the making of Black internationalist culture during the interwar period, right? In other words, if one is interested in the connection between negritude and the Harlem Renaissance, it also means for someone such as himself, who has those expertise in French or Francophone literatures, as well as African American literature, being able to read across those archives actually enabled him to be able to sort of develop an argument about how writers such as Amos Césaire, Leopold Sédar Senghor were drawing from writers of the Harlem Renaissance. And in some senses, some of these figures were sort of moving back and forth and having conversations with each other. How works such as Claude McKay's important book, Novel Banjo, contains some really important ideas about, thinking about the ontology of Blackness and thinking about Black internationalism outside of the kind of orthodox sort of traditional ideas that are formulated through Marxism and even the communist international, thinking about questions of sexuality and masculinity that I think get a much more sort of detailed treatment in Michelle Stevens' work, right? And again, for me, it's about also just seeing the value of the kinds of expertise that people have. It's work such as this that enables one to also think. There's a way in which one can begin to ask questions. It's generative. Sorry, me just go back. It's generative because it allows one to actually see or to think about a series of other questions, right? What is the relationship between Black South African writers in the 1920s and 30s and African American writers, beyond just simply assuming that these relationships are singularly inscribed in English, right? So you might be reading a quote unquote Zulu novel, right? But it doesn't mean that the very fact that these people are engaging with the genre of the novel precludes that there's a kind of cosmopolitanism that is inscribed in those kinds of generic choices and decisions that some of these people are making, right? So if you can then begin to sort of, if you happen to have certain kinds of linguistic expertise, it might create so many other possibilities for how you could actually make connections and map out various sort of circuits and lines of transmission within the cultures of Black transnationalism and Black internationalism, which are not necessarily the same thing, right? It also creates a way of thinking about and theorizing particular kinds of texts, such as the anthology, right? And a part of what Brent Hayes Edwards does is to actually think about the anthology as framing Blackness, the ability to actually assemble ideas and texts and figures who come from different aspects of the Black diaspora through the anthology becomes a way of sort of articulating both similarity and difference across the Black diaspora in various kinds of ways, right? You know, and in that kind of way, you know, how do texts like that, such as the practice of diaspora, allow us to sort of not only maybe even read anthologies, but also read other forms of print culture, such as newspapers and periodicals, in the ways that they might be mapping their own forms of Black globality, right? Okay. Sorry, it makes this weird noise when it denies me. Okay. And Black Empire, which came out about, again, 2 years. And I think some of these things I'll come back to, that sometimes you can begin to see patterns and relationships in how certain texts also belong in certain sort of moments in as far as how they emerge, right? And as much is true with Michelle Stevens's Black Empire, which comes out at more or less the same time as Brent Hayes Edwards' book. So even though she's interested in Caribbean intellectuals in the United States, it all connects in so many ways in relation to, you know, even the experience of American empire and what it meant for Caribbean intellectuals who are colonials, but had to make decisions about how to reframe and recast their identities. When you find yourself in the US, are you a Caribbean? Are you West Indian? Are you an American? And how does sort of Black transnationalism also help to sort of formulate a response in how you also theorize your own kind of national identity, right? But also, how do you also work with sort of received notions and ideas, such as the very idea of empire, right? In order to recuperate an alternative Black archive of imagining sovereignty through the idea of empire. And of course, you know, someone such as, you know, Marcus Garvey is an important figure, but as I've seen in my research, there are other people such as Harry Dean, who at the turn of the 20th century was actually thinking about this idea of having a ship that would sort of establish Black sovereignty, and he ended up in South Africa as well as Mozambique in that quest of Black sovereignty, right? So even reading in relation to a particular kind of space might allow one to begin to sort of extend or see other kinds of possibilities and relationships, and see how certain people who might have been left out of a particular kind of genealogy are very important sort of precursors, whether or not they were acknowledged or whether they sort of met with and articulated with other more famous figures. Part of our work is to make those connections, whether that, you know, actually happened historically or not, as well, right? So again, sort of texts like this sort of create a way of being able to sort of read the archive of Black cultures and their literary imaginaries at a global scale, right? But also, Michelle Stevens is also thinking about the idea of Black masculinity, you know, and how questions of transnationalism and globality were framed and threaded precisely through the tenets of masculine experience and what that meant for the making of Caribbean literary culture, particularly in that early to mid 20th century, and what that means about the kinds of figures that emerged, but also the kinds of imaginings of freedom that you find during that period of between the First and Second World War and the moment of decolonization, which we all know, you know, by 1962, that is the moment of the collapse of the Caribbean Federation, right? And the 1960s, throughout the African continent, was the moment of, you know, various moments of independence. But by the end of that decade, you're also seeing coups, you're seeing, you know, the Biafran War, etc. So all of that sort of fraught experience of decolonization, that in some senses, one would have to sort of go back and think about the very making of these figures in order to understand how they themselves imagined the very idea of sovereignty, and how in itself it was threaded through by their own particular kinds of gendered and even sexualized experiences as well, right? And for me, that's one particular way of sort of seeing sort of these kinds of possibilities, right? So it's moving beyond the idea of is it new to thinking about what is it that this is making possible that you can actually sort of run with. And sometimes, you know, the archives you might be dealing with, or the questions might exceed the boundaries of your dissertation, but that also means an invitation for other people within our very scholarly communities to engage with some of those works, right? So there's a way in which the, you know, texts such as those that I've cited, you know, Black Empire and the Practice of Diaspora, can form in some sort of immediate sort of intellectual sense that of one's own genealogies, right? But it doesn't mean, again, that there aren't other sort of ways of deepening these kinds of genealogical relationships, right? And one of the arguments that I would make is that sometimes the quest for novelty can have a way of also erasing or disarticulating the various ways in which other figures who might not have been noted might have been asking some of the very same kinds of questions that then re-emerge much later on, right? So for instance, in South Africa, you know, the work of, I think during this period, the work of Saul Blakey is quite important, right? He interacted with the Du Boises, you know, and many of the other figures, or some of the other figures that that are mentioned in the Practice of Diaspora and Black Empire. But some of these figures as well, from the vantage of South Africa, we're also asking some of the same questions that become pertinent as scholars over the decades come back and ask questions about sovereignty, about belonging, about the vexed relationship between nation and empire, race, gender, and class, right? You know, and for me, one of the things that I found really fascinating is also having sort of thought about these questions in relation to the idea of the exceptionality of South Africa, that Mahmoud Mandani really sort of makes a very important argument in questioning in Citizen and Subject. You know, and when I came across a pamphlet by Govan Begi that was thinking about the you know, the Glenn Gray Act in the Eastern Cape, and how he's also making similar kinds of arguments in the 1930s as well, right? So there are so many people, for those of us who sort of work in relation to Black intellectuals, who were not necessarily academics in the kind of formal sense, but the kinds of political questions that they asked are very important precursors to those that some major figures sort of make. And in that sense, warrant some kind of articulation within our framing of certain kinds of intellectual genealogies and relationships, right? So at Govanberg, you might not necessarily appear within a kind of within a reading list about certain kinds of questions. But if you're able to make those kinds of connections, that's really important, right? And sometimes what it means is that if there's a text that you come across, or material that you come across while working on your dissertation that has long sort of been neglected or not published, those are also ongoing projects that you could engage with, right? That's a space for you to maybe say, is there a possibility for this work to be republished once you've sort of established yourself, et cetera, et cetera. And that could also allow you more space in order to sort of make the case for some of these works and ideas as well, right? Okay, this is covered, right? And this is the importance for me of working with the specific stroke familiar, that we find ourselves in a moment where some of the prevailing kinds of theoretical discourses or discourses about what theory is in various kinds of ways might emerge from certain geographies, right, that also have their own imminence as far as their emergence and pertinence and the work that it's doing, right? But it doesn't mean that we should give up working with our own sort of so-called local contexts, with the specific and the familiar, as a site for thinking about sort of generative ideas as well, about some of the very same kinds of questions, right? And I'll give another example. So for me, as someone who was also at the University of Cape Town between 2015 and 2018, and seeing all of the kind of political sort of provocations of movements that were also just particular to the University of Cape Town, was important because it was a space from which one could actually, in a very sort of almost tactile way, sort of sense and feel certain kinds of experiences, and I think sometimes we undermine how sort of projects and ideas can also be generated from those kinds of experiences as well, right? But it also became a way in which one could also begin to ask questions about, I remember, if you at the on Queen Victoria Street, where the other statue of Cecil John Rhodes is, where he looks like he's making some sort of Nazi salute, right? But he's actually pointing out at the hinterland, right? That kind of imperial project and that kind of gesture, right? But if one follows that kind of gesture to think about, what is it that kind of iconography made possible beyond his own life, right? One of the things that became quite evident to me is that actually if one began to sort of think about the sort of decade or two after Cecil John Rhodes' death, and when one moves outside of South Africa, one sees how this sort of colonial project was itself simultaneously imperial, right? So when South Africa occupies Namibia in 1915, and then in 1946, Jan Smuts tries to claim Namibia as the fifth province of South Africa 2 years before the advent of apartheid, one is also seeing both the afterlives and the reconfiguration of Cecil John Rhodes' imperial ambitions, right? So in some senses, it always brings about these problematics about what are the kinds of geopolitical configurations that allow one to actually see in various kinds of ways how these projects themselves have afterlives, how they articulate to various kinds of histories, even within the moment of decolonization, right? And these are some of the things that, again, we're not thinking outside of the kinds of questions that Michelle Stevens is thinking about in Black Empire in relation to, the emergence of America as a global superpower and its own imperial projects, right? But what it does is to sort of think about how then does white supremacy allow these different geographies to actually articulate different kinds of imperial projects, right? Okay. Yeah. So rather than the question, is it new? I'm more interested in the question of, does our work reconfigure existing relationships and point out new and different possibilities, right? And I raise this because oftentimes the idea of being able to sort of sell and market a book hinges on this idea of novelty. But within the realm of our own reading of each other's work and the work of our predecessors and peers, it is actually more about establishing certain kinds of intellectual relationships, right? Of being able to see certain kinds of threads and maybe loose ends that one can sort of take in very, very original directions, but what's the point of having something that doesn't ultimately, that one isn't able to sort of ground in some sort of genealogical narrative that has a very, very specific personal narrative as well, right? And I think here it's also important to keep in mind that a dissertation is not a book, like I said, that there's some things that a dissertation are there to demonstrate. And indeed, if you write that really stunningly original and exhaustive dissertation, well, publishers are going to want something different for your book. So you might actually find yourself having really exhausted yourself, trying to sort of think about, having sort of poured your heart and soul into something, right? So there's some kinds of strategic choices that one has to make that also should come with an implicit understanding of what a dissertation is and what kind of work that it does. And then a book as a different kind of text, and as a text that's going to do slightly different work from that which your dissertation had done. But for many of us who are, well, I think I'm fairly close to, about 7 years ago, I finished my thesis. But the dissertation is also something of the first draft of your book, right? And I often think one of the pressures and issues that one sort of faces, especially in South Africa, is that once you're done with your PhD, you immediately deal with the pressure of publishing, right? And so how then do you balance the thinning out of the material of your book while still being able to sort of produce work, right? And I think for me, the best thing that I could say is about keeping in mind that your dissertation is leading up to your first book, right? That there's, in a way, you wouldn't want to sort of start sort of afresh on a new book. And in fact, it's one of the things that often sort of delay many younger academics, right? That your book, because you're now caught up in sort of the mill of sort of producing all these articles, that your book can become deferred, right? But your book is also your calling card. It's also that text through which you get a different kind of legibility and visibility. But it's also an important step in your own sort of development within the academy. So there's something of a continuity, particularly for us younger academics, between the dissertation and the book. And for me, that link is actually within the South African context, British context, American context would be different. It is that link between lecturer, senior lecturer, and associate professor. that oftentimes when your first book comes out is when you're sort of then moving toward that associate professor level, right? And all of that is basically going to be carried, in most instances by the research that you would have done as a PhD student, right? So it's often important to keep in mind the kind of trajectory itself that you might be mapping, right? The process might take longer for some and shorter for others, but this is the kind of material that one is working with and where it can take one, right? Okay. I think I should end there. We have about 20 or so minutes. Dominic, you're going to be the...
Yes, perfect. We're going to have a Q&A for like the remaining of the time until 5, if you don't mind. And yeah, I'm going to maybe like ask a first question, and then I please everybody, you can raise your hand, ask question in the chat, whatever is comfortable for you. But thank you so much, Khwezi, for those remarks. I think it's very useful for young like the doctoral fellows, but also postdocs, etc., that are thinking about also that next step of publishing their first book. And I really appreciated what you said and your reflection on the quest for novelty. It seems that it's something that it's quite obsessive with how people like what people ask from sometimes from doctoral fellows, from young scholars, but also how we think we should advertise our work, like what we do is new, but what do we do when it's not new anymore, and when it's it's been a few years, and that even like sometimes the good work sometimes that we do in like communicating about our work, publishing articles, is making our own work obsolete in a way, like obsolete in the sense of novelty. Is it new? And I really appreciated your insistence on the archaeology, the genealogy, the archives, like and the reconfiguration, because that's what ultimately is making the contribution important, and the interest, or the interest of the contribution durable, and not just something that we are going to make ourselves obsolete in a few years. I was reflecting, I'm somebody who has worked on the past a lot, on memories, on even as an anthropologist of the contemporary. Yourself, you discuss your work on the empire, etc. And I was thinking, because also I'm in the context and with also colleagues and doctoral fellows that are working on very, very, very like novel, on novelty, on very recent technologies. Do you say it's also important to think about those reconfiguration and archives when your object seems to be like giving you this like air of novelty, or excitement of something that was never said before, because the object itself is new. So I was wondering, like, if you could like reflect on what it is to overcome the appeal of novelty when you are working on an object that is very, I don't know, like very current and exciting in itself. Like, what kind of work shall we do? Shall like scholars do also, like, to preserve like that kind of like lasting quality of their contribution when the object maybe like I don't know, a fad or something?
I need to unmute. Thank you. It's such a tricky one, right? Because what often happens and what can happen is, for instance, for me, the idea, for instance, of decoloniality was fairly when I was finishing was fairly, Manyolo, etc. I was aware of it, right? But it's only when I arrived at UCT and then you realize that at a political level and how people are sort of thinking about their own sort of subjectivities and this particular moment in South African history, this language has become quite important, right? But I was also not, by the time I left and now, sometimes some of these ideas and some of these keywords can also, that were at some point very novel, and sometimes they're doing very important theoretical and political work, right? And then within a number of years, some of these ideas can sort of move toward the mainstream in such a way that they also enable any and everybody to tag along and join, certain kinds of projects. And we've seen it happening before, in relation to, post-colonial theory and so much. And what I think I've learned is also, again, being able to map up one's own sort of intimate intellectual biography in relation to those ideas. And indeed, some of these ideas are quite generational, right? That for some of us, the idea of theory was linked to the work of your Homi Babas. Fanon was pretty consistent. But over the years, it's the work of people such as your Fred Moten, if you're thinking about African American studies or Black studies and others. So these things sort of change, over time, and I think it's registering an awareness of that. But I think sometimes what one can contribute is a really strong, well-argued and detailed sort of study, right? That can also be a part of helping people to reflect on what the process and project of thinking at a particular moment was, and sometimes, that can sound, fairly modest, but I think over one's sort of career, there will be other moments in which sort of different sort of ideas sort of emerge, right? So now there's a lot of talk about care, et cetera, and, sometimes we find ourselves having to navigate all of those things. And I do think that sometimes it's being able to find something sort of personal and something that might be a bit local, right? That might be able to allow one to maybe be able to register some sense of, this thing might seem like it's new, but there's a kind of familiarity about this. So now people are talking about the human and the non-human, and people are talking about Amos Tutuola. Amos Tutuola is always in and out of different kinds of conversations. And in the 50s and 60s, there are particular kinds of conversations about Amos Tutuola. So the theories have changed, but people are still reading Amos Tutuola, So those are some of the things that I find interesting. Not a comprehensive answer, but an observation.
Thank you so much. We have in the chat first question. So we have like congratulatory posts, but I'm not going to read them. you can find that. But so we have a question from, I think, Kathleen. Kathleen, do you want to unmute or? Okay, yeah. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for the opportunity, and hi Khwezi, thank you so much for the talk. I kind of already sort of phrased it in the chat how I would, sort of in my best words, I think, which is basically just that, I really appreciated how you were talking about situating your dissertation not as something sort of new that sort of falls from the sky, but kind of is situated in a genealogical web or a conversation. Hi. And so I'm wondering if maybe, if you think that that's also something and I think it's maybe also in relation to what you're just talking about now, do you think that this is a sort of changing politics of how we understand how knowledge is produced? And maybe this is something almost like a decolonial direction for the university, or how we understand knowledge. Yeah, I was wondering if you had some thoughts about that. You're muted.
Okay, yes. Oh, can you unmute?
Thanks, Kathleen. So what's the novelty, the changing politics as it relates to the idea of newness?
Yeah, just thinking about like how, I think what you're speaking to also speaks to like a different understanding of how we understand like how we make knowledge. It's not that it sort of just appears to us, but that it's like in a conversation with peers. And yeah, if you think that's maybe a changing politics for the university or something.
I think so. I think it's interesting that the idea. I think that the question of the future, given all sorts of sort of global environmental, ecological, and economic crises that we're dealing with, is that the attempt to sort of find the new thing. And I'll give an example. I mean, the journal that I'm one of the co-editors for African Studies, there was a moment between 2020 and 2021 where we got a lot of submissions on COVID-19, right? And I mean, some people were trying to sort of make fairly bold, sort of theoretical observations about the pandemic, but it was just, right? It was just new. But in some senses, you could also see the ways in which, some of that work also needed to simmer, get a little bit more time, but also at the same time, there was also something familiar about the radical abandonment that people were also experiencing, right? So how does that also sort of find different kinds of articulations, while what Raymond Williams would call the emergent is still sort of finding some sort of shape that we can then begin to sort of deal with. But I also think, part of the neoliberalization of the academy is to also see us as existing in the marketplace of ideas. And that's part of the thing to say at some point, we have to make our livelihoods in relation to the work that we do. But how does that not get completely usurped by the logic, what I think of as these sort of neoliberal logics that sort of frame our work in relation to the idea of new, right? Because if it's not everything changes the field and not everything is new by definition of that, there's a logic of exceptionality about it that also can have a way of diminishing our own ability to see ourselves as belonging within a larger community. And sometimes in retrospect, you might read your work and realize that actually there's someone you might not have met who was thinking about similar questions, not because you're plagiarizing each other, but because you're working out of the same problem space. Right? And sometimes that's really, really profound.
Thank you, Khwezi. I was thinking, I had a question for you. So you are you have done work in the US. You've been at the University of Cape Town in Joburg. I was wondering, something that is new in one continent might not be new in another one. And I wonder if you also had a reflection on lives of transnational scholars as well, and that are also in a way like participating to the diffusion of ideas, and also sometimes are able like to market themselves, through the ideas that they are bringing with them. And I'm not saying that necessarily as something that is cynical and bad, and but certainly there's something like that, and with translation, it's also very often the case. Like I'm myself, I'm from France. I see that sometimes there's a huge delay in the way like ideas that are existing in French academia, for example, are suddenly like considered new, like in the US, like 10 or 15 years after. And in the same way, like ideas that are very I don't know, very familiar to, for example, like South Africans or Brazilians are considered as new and shocking and radical in France, right? So there's this also sometimes this, in our lives as we travel as academics, we encounter those kind of delay, right? That in the world with different language that we work in, what is new in some place is not new in another one.
No, absolutely. And I think as you're talking, the first thing that came to mind is that it's not, if you think about, for instance, a Fanon, right? It's Martinique, France, and Algeria. that one cannot think about these figures and their work out, without that sort of context of movement, as it inscribes them as colonial subjects, as anti-colonial subjects, as transnational figures, as African revolutionaries, et cetera, So I think that sense of mobility is also important, because we live in a moment, either because of COVID or because of the way in which national identities, I guess in South Africa, you could say, are increasingly acquiring a particular kind of exclusionary logic, right? But if you're from Mali or Nigeria or so many other places in the continent, some of these experiences in the 60s and 70s were also part of the problems of decolonization, isn't it? So, and again, for me, it takes one back to, there's a political sort of argument to be made about how not only just the movement of ideas, but also the movements of people. You never know. You could have the same ideas encountered by different people as they move around, and they could generate very different kinds of insights, right? So there's a political argument to be made about the necessity, in as far as the sort of knowledge project, of people to have the right of mobility, right? Because that's when these particular kinds of connections can be made. It's also about how people are able to access archive movement. Also, it can allow you to sort of access different kinds of languages, But it can also, as you're saying, I guess that's the other sort of deeper level of being able to access different kinds of temporalities, right? Where something that's new here might be very well established there and in so many places. I mean, I remember, there was a book that made an argument about theory from the South, and the idea that because people in the global South have already gone through the forms of ecological devastation that are now sort of confronting the global North, it's a very important space from which to sort of theorize what it means to belong in the world. But IMSS made that argument back in the 50s in Discourse on Colonialism too. Right, so there's a particular, again, some of these ideas can recirculate in certain kinds of ways that themselves, again, read through a different genealogy, sound sort of incredibly familiar and not new, as you're saying. Right?
Yeah, no, thank you for your response. And as you were like discussing or mentioning Fanon, I'm amazed at the kind of like complicated circulation of his ideas.
Yeah.
That's where like not audible or not received at all in France for decades, and were rediscovered like through the eyes of others and through the work of non-francophone authors.
Yeah.
And I was thinking also, as you were responding, that there's still a particular like kind of value to what appear novel, even when it has been around, but the kind of like the kind of spark of ignition that the idea of novelty is creating and causing in a national like academic community, for example. I think there's still something valuable about like the illusion or the fiction of novelty, and maybe can it be also like the kind of like particular excitement that people have about like their new archaeologies of ancient ideas? That's what I was thinking of as you were discussing, like the merits of it.
Yeah. Cool. Shall we let other?
Absolutely. I'm really I'm looking for those hands. Please, like we have only a few more minutes. So, you know, I'm happy to just use those minutes, but I think that would be great if you know, especially some of the doctoral fellows have questions on, you know, like doing dissertation or publishing dissertation. I know that there's a lot of, you know, yeah, you mentioned the anxieties around, like, you know, like the imperative of producing something exciting and something that is going to allow you to market yourself and to get jobs. And I know that those questions are also amongst our fellow at HUMA.
Yeah, you know, I thought, let me just say, for me, it was like it's sort of something that I felt, I guess, it sort of say something about, because there's also the questions of disciplines, right? So increasingly, there's the demand for people to be interdisciplinary, but jobs are not always going to be available in interdisciplinary spaces. There might be in sort of certain disciplinary sort of boundaries. So then, how does your work also allow you to have the kind of flexibility to say, actually, I can function in an African studies environment, but you know, I'm an anthropologist, so that's where you are. That there's, in a sense, that the question of genealogy within how things are also currently configured also means that there's certain contingency that might also mean, in some senses, how do you then, what kinds of spaces do you find yourself in, right? There aren't many spaces like HUMA, the CHR at the University of the Western Cape, and then there are these sort of traditional departments, you know, that in one way or another, some of us might maybe be applying to, you know. So how does our work? There's the sort of current sort of appeal for work to be transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I've even seen someone described as a post-disciplinary scholar, you know. But then there's the question of where do you land? Right? You need to find a landing spot, you know, and your work needs to enable you to do that simultaneously.
Yeah, no, it's a very good remark, and that's I've met a lot of like young doctors that were kind of disappointed at the fact that their brilliant degree in a very like amazing transdisciplinary program was not well necessarily like received like favorably by department I wanted to have, you know, to make sure that they had like, you know, English specialist, anthropologist or sociologist, and I've seen that many times. So those are also that's probably also another conversation on how you present yourself. With all the agility that you have, the flexibility that you have, the invention that you have to also like, yeah, present your own ideas and your own work. Yeah, but I see I don't see more questions. So I guess it's 5:01, so it's time for us to wrap the session. Thank you so much, Khwezi Mkhize, for your generosity, your presence here. I think your contribution was really important and gave us a lot of you know, matter to think around, and you know, certainly, like, you know, like next time somebody asks for Novelty, I will have your recommendation in mind. So thank you so much. We'll have a final seminar in 2 weeks. So please follow us on social media to learn about this new session. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.